Well, it's true in real estate, and it's also true in where the body deposits fat when there's excess energy to be stored. One place is the so-called subcutaneous location. That is fat just below the skin. You can see it. You can see it. It's kind of that spongy feeling on your buttocks, thighs, and other locations. That's a relatively benign form of fat. It's not all that metabolically active, does not contribute to such things as insulin resistance, risk for heart disease, dementia, breast cancer, and other conditions. So it's relatively inert. It does provide a weight stress to weight-bearing joints like knees and hips, but beyond that, subcutaneous fat is really not a problem. And by the way, when someone has liposuction, it's that very benign subcutaneous fat being extracted, as compared to the much more dangerous abdominal visceral fat. That is fat that encircles the abdominal organs. It involves the intestines, liver, pancreas, and other abdominal organs. Well, that fat, unlike subcutaneous fat, is very metabolically active. It's also inflamed. It is itself inflamed. If you were to biopsy that abdominal fat, you would see it's filled with inflammatory white blood cells that are inflaming that fat. And a lot of the inflammatory mediators enter the bloodstream. They act locally and can inflame, for instance, the liver, but they also enter the bloodstream. The inflammatory mediators enter the bloodstream, and that's a source for inflammation body-wide and insulin resistance. And all that means is the organs of the body, the brain, liver, muscle, other organs, are incapable of properly responding to insulin, and you need to have insulin because that's how blood glucose enters cells. So when there's insulin resistance, those organs don't respond properly. So the pancreas compensates by producing huge amounts of insulin, 10, 20, 30, 100-fold more insulin to force glucose to enter cells. So that high level of insulin also causes expansion of abdominal visceral fat. So abdominal visceral fat causes insulin resistance and inflammation that in turn causes more abdominal visceral fat to accumulate. So it's a vicious cycle. The more abdominal fat you have, the more inflamed you are, the more insulin resistant you are, the more it encourages deposition of abdominal visceral fat. So it's abdominal visceral fat that underlies so many health conditions in modern people. It's been made worse by silly things like telling people to cut their saturated fat and cholesterol, eat more healthy whole grains. All these dietary guidelines, at least the old form of dietary guidelines, and the exploitative practices of the food industry have caused expansion of abdominal visceral fat. Now, one of the difficulties with abdominal visceral fat is if you have a big protuberant abdomen, of course you have lots of abdominal visceral fat. But even if you have a flat abdomen, you can still have an excess quantity of abdominal visceral fat. And for that reason, it's maybe helpful to measure it, especially if you have some residual problem that suggests that abdominal visceral fat is driving abnormal phenomena, as in these examples I'm showing you. So note that in Julie, whose fat is mostly in the buttocks and thighs, the so-called pear-shaped, she's pretty metabolically healthy, even though she's overweight and has a higher BMI. A BMI, let's say, about 30 or so. But her triglycerides are 78, not bad. I would regard a perfect triglyceride level of 60 milligrams per deciliter or less. Well, she's not that far off. Likewise, her hemoglobin A1C just above perfect. Perfect would be 5.0% or less. She's at 5.2%. Her measure of inflammation, C-reactive protein, is just modestly elevated, 1.5 milligrams. Ideal would be less than 1. So she's not too bad off, even though she's overweight, even though her BMI is approaching or is at the borderline of the obese range. But look at Rachel. Same body weight, same BMI. So both ladies weigh 180 pounds. Both ladies have a BMI of 30. But Rachel has all the markings of excess abdominal visceral fat. She's hypertensive, mildly hypertensive. Her HDL is low, HDL cholesterol. Her triglycerides are high, 60 milligrams per deciliter or less is ideal. She's at 190. Her blood glucose is in the pre-diabetic range. Her hemoglobin A1C likewise in the pre-diabetic range, and her C-reactive protein of 3.0 milligrams suggests body-wide inflammation. Two people, same BMI, same body weight. And by the way, this example is from my Super Body book, where I focus a lot on these kinds of issues, on the location of fat, how to control it, and even more importantly, location and quantity of muscle you have. And these things can be measured. So in the case of Rachel, she's got too much abdominal visceral fat. You can see from the illustrations, they don't look that different. This is very common. You don't have to have a big protuberant abdomen to be harboring a lot of abdominal visceral fat and thereby have all these metabolic distortions that lead you down the path of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, coronary disease, dementia, breast cancer, fatty liver, hypertension, all the conditions that are driven largely by an excess of abdominal visceral fat. Now, the third depot or location of fat is one that follows abdominal visceral fat. So when you have too much abdominal visceral fat, there's a tendency for the body to start storing fat in odd locations. It could be your knees or hips, the actual joints themselves. You can see this on an MRI or CAT scan. You see globules of fat, and that fat inflames joint cartilage and accelerates its degradation. So it takes you closer and closer to arthritis, bone-on-bone arthritis. So that fat can also accumulate around the heart, epicardial and pericardial fat, and that accelerates heart disease in many forms, especially coronary disease. It causes coronary atherosclerotic plaque to worsen much faster. Fat can also accumulate in the liver. Of course, you've heard of fatty liver, and that can lead down to a lot of trouble long term. In the pancreas, where it can damage the pancreas and its capacity to produce insulin. In the kidneys, where it can cause kidney damage and kidney disease. So these forms of fat are called ectopic fat. Fat accumulating where it doesn't belong, but it tends to follow abdominal visceral fat. You know, in some ways, I'm grateful for all the blunders we've made as a society in dietary guidelines, food consumption practices, because you know what? If we didn't create all this horrible levels of overweight and obesity in this world, we wouldn't have learned all these lessons about how to manage these kinds of problems, because we'd all be skinny. But you can see the problem here. Dietary guidelines, exploitative food practices have caused these problems. Now we have to deal with them. But now we understand why it happened, because of all the mistakes made. So how do you undo this? Well, first of all, it's helpful to measuring. So you can do that with a DEXA scan, and you have to specify sometimes that you want your visceral fat to be measured also. They don't always do it. Now, that's not the easiest test to obtain. So an easier way would be to get a bioimpedance scale, a so-called SMART scale. But you only want to get the devices that include a visceral fat score. They don't actually measure by kilograms or pounds, because those devices are incapable of that, at least the current devices. What they did, at least what I believe they did, because they won't tell you, because they tell it's proprietary. That is, they'll give you a score, and every device is a little different. Some devices will say things like your visceral fat score is somewhere between 0 and 12 or 0 and 60, so you can't really compare device to device. You want to stick to one device. But Withings, Omron, Tanita, and Hume, as well as the professional in-body device, are the ones that have a visceral fat score. Now, what I believe they did was they went to the CAT scan and MRI evidence, cross-sectional CAT scan or MRI, that have proven to be the gold standard, where it's been shown that 100 square centimeters or more of abdominal visceral fat on these cross-sectional studies suggests a real problem with your health. Below 100, less problem. Now, that's not really entirely true. It's really a continuous thing. It's like hemoglobin A1C. If you're 5.7%, you're just in the low end of prediabetes, but you're still subject to huge risk for numerous diseases, even though you're only prediabetic. Same thing here. It's a continuous measurement. But that's what these devices have done. They used 100 square centimeters of visceral fat by CAT scan or MRI and then correlated that to their visceral fat score. So let's say you choose a device that includes visceral fat scoring. Let's say you score a 5, and they say that's too high for you. Why is it too high? Well, it's correlated to the cross-sectional CT or MRI. But you should know, if their cutoff of the device you have is 5, you want to be probably below 3. At the very low end of the range, right? Because 4 is probably still have some quantity of dangerous abdominal visceral fat. But a bioimpedance scale with the visceral fat scoring function can be very helpful. Now, if you prove to have excessive abdominal visceral fat, what do you do about it? Easy. Don't eat the foods that create insulin resistance and inflammation and address common distortions of your physiology that take you down that path. So what foods cause insulin resistance and inflammation? Wheat, grains, and sugars. And that's a whole conversation of its own, but all you need to do is check your blood glucose after eating, say, a bagel or a stack of pancakes or a bowl of pasta, and you watch your blood glucose go sky high. A normal person, non-diabetic, non-insulin resistant, will have a blood glucose of 150 to 200 after those kinds of food. High blood glucose causes high blood insulin, and that repetitive cycle creates insulin resistance, cultivates abdominal visceral fat and ectopic fat, and inflammation, and takes you down the road. So you can start with diet. No wheat, no grains, no sugars, contrary to dietary guidelines, contrary to common wisdom, unfortunately. Another step you can take is restore nutrients that are lacking in modern life. Because of the way we live, you have to drink water that's filtered, right? You can't drink water from a lake, stream, or river. It's contaminated. It's got sewage. It's got herbicides, pesticides. So you must filter your water. Well, water filtration, modern water filtration is very good at removing all magnesium. So you don't get any magnesium from water. Modern produce, broccoli, carrots, all those things should be rich in magnesium, but they're not because of modern farm practices made worse more recently, sadly, by the huge accumulation of microplastics in soil. It's gotten so bad that we now can see a reduction in nutrients and even in the crop yield for farmers on farm produce. And so farm produce, much less magnesium, almost no magnesium as compared to, say, what wild plants used to have. So we supplement magnesium. Likewise, vitamin D. Most of us live our lives indoors without sun exposure, or you live in a northern climate. You wear clothes when you go outside, covering a lot of body surface area, and we do lose the capacity to activate vitamin D in the skin as we get older, particularly beyond age 40. So we supplement vitamin D. Omega-3 fatty acids. Most people have abandoned consumption of organ meats that were richer in omega-3 fatty acids, especially brain. And we can't eat all the fish we want, seafood, because it's contaminated now by mercury and microplastics. So we resort to fish oil to get our omega-3 fatty acids. And then lastly, iodine, especially if you live inland away from the ocean, because all the iodine in the world is in the seas and the oceans. And if you live inland and your crops and your animals as livestock are iodine deficient. And so we supplement iodine. People have forgotten that iodine deficiency was among the biggest public health problems that plagued humans all throughout human history until 1924, when the FDA and related agencies in other countries mandated or actually requested that salt manufacturers add iodine to table salt. Of course, use of salt led to other issues that the FDA and other agencies misinterpreted, not recognizing that salt retention is a product of insulin resistance and bad dietary advice. It's not a result of excess salt intake. So in my program, we don't limit salt, we salt our food. In fact, when you lose insulin resistance, you diurese. You urinate water and salt. You actually have to salt your water and food. So those four nutrients, magnesium, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, and iodine, when restored properly, they synergize to minimize insulin resistance, the factor that cultivates accumulation of abdominal visceral fat and ectopic fat. Now we go another step further to give you even bigger control, greater control over these processes, and that is to address the disrupted gastrointestinal microbiome. So virtually everybody in the modern world, because of our wild overexposure to antibiotics and other factors, glyphosate, herbicides, pesticides, microplastic, PFAS, on and on, have disrupted the composition of the gastrointestinal microbiome. Several things have happened. One, there's been elimination or reduction in literally hundreds if not thousands of species that were beneficial to you in the colon. Well, those beneficial species, part of their role was to suppress the excessive proliferation of damaging or destructive fecal microbial species. We call them proteobacteria or Pseudomonas. These are species like E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, Proteus, and many others. Those fecal microbes, gram-negative proteobacteria, we would say, overpopulate in the colon, and that's the likely cause that drives risk for colon cancer, diverticular disease, ulcerative colitis, and other conditions. Well, when this happens, in many people, about 50% of the U.S. population, those excessively populated fecal microbes, have ascended into the small intestine, into the 24 feet of small intestine. Now, the small intestine is permeable, very permeable by design. That's where you absorb nutrients, like amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, minerals. Well, when fecal microbes inhabit or colonize the small intestine, it inflames the small intestine, makes it even more permeable to microbial breakdown products, like endotoxin that's in the cell wall of these proteobacteria species. That endotoxin enters the bloodstream and it massively amplifies insulin resistance and inflammation. So that's a major driver of the expansion of abdominal visceral fat. Now, how do we deal with that? Well, there's a number of ways, but my way is to make and consume something I call SIBO yogurt. All it is, it's not yogurt. It looks and smells like yogurt, but it's not yogurt. We ferment 3 microbes. 3 microbes chosen specifically for their capacity to colonize the small intestine, or in case of Bacillus subtilis, to germinate. It's a spore, germinates in the ileum. So colonize or germinate in the small intestine where SIBO occurs, and any benefits occurs in the small intestine will translate into the colon because things go downward, right? And species chosen for their capacity to produce bacteriocins. These are natural antibiotics effective in killing those fecal proteobacteria. So bacteriocins are smarter than prescription antibiotics because prescription antibiotics are indiscriminate, more or less. They kill good bacteria, they don't kill bad bacteria very well. So bacteriocins are specific for killing those proteobacteria, like E. coli, Klebsiella, etc. So we make this into a yogurt-like food. We use my method of a prolonged fermentation, 36 hours, at human body temperature. So these are human microbes. We're not fermenting the microbes in conventional yogurt. Those aren't human microbes for the most part. Those are just microbes that have traditionally been used to make yogurt. We're going to take human-sourced microbes and ferment them. And we're going to use prolonged fermentation. So, for instance, Lactobacillus reuteri doubles every 3 hours or so at human body temperature. We're going to let it ferment for 36 hours, 12 doublings. And if fermented by itself, you get about 300 billion counts of this microbe per half-cup serving. Ideally, you ferment each one separately for the maximum count. When you can co-ferment them, and we actually got a lot of success in the beginning when we started doing this with the 3 microbes co-fermented, but there tends to be competition among those 3, and I think that Bacillus subtilis probably takes over after a while. If you do co-ferment, you probably want to start fresh every week, every batch, so that you don't allow one microbe like subtilis to take over. So ideally, you ferment each separately, consume a quarter cup, maybe a half cup at most, per day, minimum 4 weeks, and then intermittently, like 2 or 3 times a week thereafter, probably forever, until we understand how to make these microbes take up permanent residence. Right now, we don't know how to do that. So ferment these things, and that has been unexpectedly and hugely successful in normalizing breath hydrogen gas. That's how we measure SIBO. You don't have to do this, but there is, so you know, a consumer device, the AIR device, AIRE. Blow into it, talk to your smartphone, 0 to 10. There's a whole protocol to follow if you're going to use this thing. It's in my Super Gut book. And if you have SIBO, because you mapped the presence of microbes in the small intestine, SIBO yogurt has been, there are other ways to do it. There are some herbal antibiotic regimens I talk about in my Supergut book. There's also, of course, conventional antibiotics like Xifaxan. That's also an option. I would do the yogurt because not only has it proven very effective in normalizing SIBO, it also starts the process of restoring beneficial microbes, because those 3 microbes are keystone or foundational, and it encourages the proliferation of other beneficial species like Faecalibacterium, Akkermansia, Ruminicaceae, and many, many others. And each of those species provides additional benefits on skin, bone health, joint health, arterial health, heart health, uterine health, prostate health. So it's worth doing all 3 and doing it intermittently after your initial several-week period to get rid of the SIBO. So this is how you minimize abdominal visceral fat, and you can measure it, you can track it. That bioimpedance scale I mentioned earlier, you can track it. If your bioimpedance scale says your device measures visceral fat 0 to 12 and you're a 7, you want to see it drop 6, 5, 4, 3 as you minimize abdominal visceral fat. So that's the program we use. Now, it does help to exercise also. Exercise appears to have an outsized benefit on reducing myosteatosis, which is fat deposition in muscle, which is a very bad thing to have, that accompanies the abdominal visceral fat. So exercise. Now, when I say exercise, I'm not talking about 2 hours a day, 6 days a week, like as has been done in some of these studies. I'm talking about going for a nice walk, riding your bike, raking the leaves. Activities that involve physical effort. Does not have to be fancy, does not have to be expensive, but it is important to get physical effort, and that will amplify all the benefits of all the things we've talked about. Now, if these kinds of approaches appeal to you, that is, natural approaches that your doctor doesn't know about, doesn't care about, but have been proven to work very well, I invite you to join my conversations here in this YouTube channel, my Defiant Health podcast, my books, of course, Super Gut, most recently Super Body, which is all about body composition with regards to muscle, abdominal fat, ectopic fat, etc. And if you want conversation and support, my membership website, which is innercircle.drdavisinfinitehealth.com. You'll find all the recipes, by the way, in both the Super Gut and Super Body books, as well as my blog, WilliamDavisMD.com.